Hey gang, sorry I couldn't be with you tonight, but I hope this video can get you started. I'm going to talk just very briefly and then I'm going to ask you guys to do a discussion. I've asked Beth to kind of guide you along and she can get some other volunteers if it helps. I think as you do this, you'll see that God kind of shows you all a few different things that are all true that we get from His Word as we look at it. We're looking at week 2 now of our kind of series we're doing. I'm calling Foundations, Truths from Creation That You Need to Know. It explains how the world works and why things happen the way they do. Quick review from last week, we saw that the first principle was purpose and that God works with purpose. He has a reason for what he's doing. He's not random. And the big reason I want you to see this is what we find true in Genesis, we'll find true forever, all the way to the end of the world, and it's especially true today. In the idea of purpose, we see that in God's purposes, he works with a process, and that's important. Process means that God does things in a certain way, and this is an example for us that often in our life that he's working a process, and we can't shortcut it. We can't make it go faster. We can't really do it differently than the way God has done it. So he chose to create the world in 6 days. He could have done it in 5. He could have done it in 12, but he chose 6, step by step, moving through it. We also see that he has a goal. He is going to make man in his own image, and we see in Romans that he continues to work to make all Christians into the image of his son, Jesus Christ, and that is a goal. And in what he does in our life, he continues to work with a goal. Then we see the idea of equality, that he doesn't play favorites, that all men are really, truly created equal in his sight. Now, equal doesn't mean same. It doesn't mean we all have the same talents. It doesn't even mean we all have the same opportunities. But it means there's no favoritism, and God does not limit his power in one person's life and give more in another person's life. And importantly, in Jeremiah, you find that God created Jeremiah even from the womb with a purpose for his life. And if he did it for one purpose, or for one person, he does it for all people. Now, this week, we're going to look at opposition. Because with God's purpose and with God working in the world, we find in the creation story that there is opposition. Now, Genesis chapter 3 has this, and I encourage you to read it at home and in your own time. But I'm going to focus on one verse in Genesis chapter 3, and it'll be verse 4. But let's read a couple to kind of get the background out of it. It says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord had made. He said to the woman, 'Did God really say, you must not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die.' 'You will not surely die,' the serpent said to the woman. 'For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.'" Well, we're going to focus on verses 4 and 5. The little sheet of paper I gave you will say 4, but it's really 4 and 5. That paragraph there, where the serpent answered and said, "You will not surely die," the serpent said to the woman. Now get this, "For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil." So he told her that she could be like God, knowing good and evil, and she could achieve this by eating the fruit. Now, we see here the devil, if you want to look at your fill in the blanks, because I know some of you are obsessive compulsive and have to get those blanks just perfect. So as we look at the first blank there, the devil represented by the serpent opposes God's plan. Opposes. That's the beginning of this idea of opposition, that there are forces out there, and particularly one force, the devil himself, that is opposing God's plan. Now, some people wanted to get rid of the devil, minimize the devil, talk like there isn't a devil, but as there is a God, there is still a devil. Now, he's not equal with God. He's a created being that rebelled against God. He is nowhere nearly as powerful as God, but he does oppose him. And compared to us, we're nowhere near as powerful as any of these spiritual beings. So we need to learn to do things God's way if we want to have God's blessing and God's success in our life. Now notice he didn't deny anything about God's purpose. He didn't say that God isn't creating Adam and Eve, or he doesn't want to make them into the image of God, but he does trick Eve. And he tricks her in, I think, three ways we can see here that has to do with these three ways that God fulfills his purpose. The first of them is he tricks Eve into creating her own purpose. She's going to learn good and evil, and she's adopting this. Now, God had wanted to create them in his own image, and God's image is a lot more than knowing just about good and evil. God's image is knowing about love. God's image is knowing about doing things correctly. God's image is about working in the world. God's image is justice. God's image is a great many things. But the devil focuses on one thing, good and evil. And I think that often in our own life, that's what he does. He doesn't really try to completely divert us from maybe the calling God's put in our life, but he's like, do it your own way. Do your own process. Make it work yourself. You can figure out a better way or a quicker way to do this than the way God's going to do it. So he tricks us, just like he tricked Eve, into developing our own process. He also, in doing this, I think I've already alluded to it, tricked her into misunderstanding the goal. Again, the goal wasn't just to know good and evil. The goal was to be like God, to be made in his image. And God had a plan that he was going to do this in, the time he was going to do this in. But Eve decided to shortcut this and do it in her own way, meet her own goal. And then finally, the idea of equality. Eve was never meant to be equal to God. She was meant to be equal to Adam. She was meant to be equal in God's creation and purpose and process and doing what God wanted to achieve in the world. But the devil says you can be like God. And I think even our own life, in this equality, sometimes we shortchange ourselves and shortcut ourselves because we want to be like God. Sometimes because we want to be like other people. Whereas God's purpose in his process, he's creating us, in God's image, but he wants us to be like us and nobody else. And so as you get into the discussion questions, check out the idea of how is God, or how did Jesus in his life see also these processes trying to be warped and twisted as he worked with his own disciples. Have fun.